Welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. Along with Rabbi Adam Mintz, we host Madlik Disruptive Torah on Clubhouse every Thursday and share it as the Madlik podcast on your favorite platform. This week's Torah portion is Vayigash. Even if you are not a proponent of numerology, you can't ignore the repeated claim of the Torah that 70 souls, Shivim Nefashim, went down to Egypt. The implied significance of the number 7 and its variants 70 and maybe even 49 provide a unique lens to view the biblical narrative. So join us as we explore Gematria, rules of biblical interpretation, and the number 70 in the Bible. Join us for 70 Faces, Shivim Panim. Well, welcome back to Madlik. And just as we have finished Hanukkah, where we added a candle every night and counted to 8, we are going to spend a half hour today doing something that I typically don't like to do. I am not into numerology. I am not into this gematria where you assign a value to each letter of the alphabet and you build mountains of interpretation based on those types of things. Typically, I look at those things and I find them artificial, I find them impugned, and ultimately I feel that they're almost an insult to the text itself, which has so much richness. Why would you need to add numerology to it? Rabbi, what is your take on gematria and numerology before we take off here?
I'm with you. I'm an old-fashioned traditionalist just like you. I don't really like numerology. But numerology is one of those things that you have to understand because it's so much a part of our tradition. Now, there's numerology, and then there's sometimes where the Torah gives us numbers. I would also make that distinction. If the Torah gives us a number 70, probably that number 70 means something.
So that literally was my point of departure. So in Genesis 46:27, it says, "And Joseph's sons who were born to him in Egypt were 2 in number. Thus the total of Jacob's household who came to Egypt was 70 persons. Kol hanefesh lebeit Yaakov haba Mitzrayma shiv'im." And as I said before, it is repeated in Exodus. It says, Exodus 1:5, the total number of persons that were of Jacob's issue came to 70, Joseph being already in Egypt. Shiv'im nafesh. So again, when it repeats it twice, and of course in the reference in our portion, it is preceded by what we found many times before, a genealogy. And the genealogy has, this is a child of Leah. This is the children of Rachel. These are the children of the 2 handmaidens. And then it says, and therefore everything added up to 70. So you can't ignore the fact that it was important to the text that it added up to 70. And this actually is the most obvious, most in-your-face version of this, but it actually, according to the rabbis, has happened before. At the end of the story of Noah, in Genesis 10, it gives all of his genealogy. He had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Yafet. And then in the beginning of Genesis 11, it says everyone on earth had the same language and the same words. And the rabbi learned from this. First of all, the rabbis go ahead and they count up each one of the members of Noah's house. And lo and behold, in our source sheet, I have quoted the Chizkuni, but he is not alone, where he adds them all up, and sure enough, there are 70. And from this comes the tradition that there are 70 nations, and that those 70 nations spoke one language before the Tower of Babel, and they spoke 70 languages after the Tower of Babel. So it seems to me, if you look at both the Jews coming down to Canaan into Egypt, and you look at the end of the portion of the flood, and you talk about moving into a new basis for humanity, at both of those junctures, you have this group of 70, and you have wonderful implications. I think the idea that there were 70 nations and that there were 70 languages had beautiful implications for us. The most beautiful is that according to the rabbis in the Tractate of Shabbat 88b, when the Torah was given, each utterance of God's mouth was divided into 70 languages. So I'll stop here. Do you believe, as now we start to explore the texts or the Bible sense of 70, does it have to do with transition? What do you make of 70 languages? What was the implications for the generation of the Exodus?
Well, I mean, there are so many different pieces of this. First of all, 70 comes from 7. And 7 is the number in the Torah of a cycle, because that's 7 days. How do I know that? I know that from the story of creation. The very first cycle in the history of the Torah, in the history of the world, is the cycle of 7. God works for 6 days and he rests on the 7th. So I know from Genesis chapter 1 that the key number in the Torah is going to be the number 7. And therefore 70, and therefore 49, and all of those variations of 7, sorry. So, right, that we know from the beginning. So therefore 70 languages and 70 people fit in. Now, we're not talking about this yet, but Rashi points out that if you count the numbers are wrong. That actually it's only 69. And that we have to get a 70th from somewhere. And Rashi suggests that number 7 comes from Yocheved. Yocheved was Moses' mother, the daughter of Levi, who's a grandson of Jacob. And the rabbis say she was Nolda ben Achomot. She was literally born on the way between Canaan and Egypt. Now that is very important in its own, because she's the mother of Moses. Moses is the one who took the Jews from Egypt to Canaan. He has to have been born from a mother who also knew both cultures. She was born between Canaan and Egypt.
So how does that relate to the number 7?
Well, that's number 70. If you just count up the numbers in this week's parsha, you don't get to 70. You need a 70th. So Rashi has this idea that the 70th is someone who was born on the way. So she didn't make it into the genealogy in the Torah, but she's counted as number 70. But obviously that's significant because you need 70. So where are you going to get 70 from?
So that's amazing. They really had to work at it. And I think what's interesting about coming to this number of 70 for the generation of the Exodus is it wasn't all that neat. They make a point, the verse makes a point of saying, and you have to add Joseph who was already there, or you have to add Joseph and his sons who were already there. So although it's this sense of 70 came down, it's not as if they came down all at once. And even a few verses earlier, it uses the word pleta, which means in later Judaism, we would have congregations who were formed that left Spain, and they were called, like the one in New York City, She'erit Yisrael, the leftover, the remnants of Israel. Pleta has the same meaning. You almost get a sense that maybe there were more people in Canaan left behind who, as would happen in a famine, didn't make the boat, weren't so lucky. But here was this remnant who reunited with their kidnapped son and became this whole. But it's part of survival too, which is fascinating to me, and that's the Ben Nechomot that you were talking about, between the walls.
I think all that's true. By the way, when the Jews left Egypt, they didn't leave with a number that was a multiple of 70. 600,000 Jews left Egypt. It's not connected to 70. I can't explain it. I'm just telling you that that's a fact.
So that becomes kind of interesting. I want to pick up.
I don't know. I can't explain it. I'm just telling you that that's a fact.
Yeah. I want to pick up a little bit on what you were saying about the number 7. Obviously, 7 times 10 is 70. 7 times 7 is 49. We count that for the years of the Shemitah, the sabbatical year, that in the 50th year then becomes the Jubilee year, the Yovel. When I was looking at the texts, I came across a comment by Everett Fox, who we've come across before. And he says, Shivim, 70, related to 7, it has to do with completeness, with something that is perfection. And then he says, I've written more on this, but also see a certain scholar named Umberto Cassuto. And Umberto Cassuto was an Italian Jewish scholar who, because of the persecution, then moved to Israel and joined the Hebrew University. And because of Everett Fox's hint, I went ahead and I opened up my book on Genesis by Cassuto. And for someone who doesn't like numbers, this was like a mind opener to me. He lists, I think, 7 or 8 ways in which the number 7 plays a part in the creation of the world. And obviously, the most obvious one is 7 days of creation. But he talks about the fact that the divine name in one of its forms occurs 70 times in the first 4 chapters. He says, and there was evening and there was morning, is 7 times. He says there are 7 chapters who the Masoratim, the people that gave punctuation to the Torah scroll. If you look at a Torah scroll, there is no punctuation. They created 7 paragraphs. He said 7 times you have this divine fiat, let there be. Then he talks about the terms light and day are found 7 times in the first paragraph, and 7 references to light in the 4th paragraph. He goes on, water is mentioned 7 times in paragraphs 2 and 3. He says the expression good appears 7 times. The first verse of the Torah, Bereshit, has 7 words. The second verse contains 14 words. And at the end, he says, to suppose that all this is a mere coincidence is not possible. Full disclosure, I think that Cassuto, who was arguing with what's called higher biblical criticism, form criticism, which implies that the Bible, especially the first chapters of Genesis, were written by different sources. And what he is arguing is, if you believe that these, the numerology of 7 and 14 and were built into the text, it's pretty difficult to assume that the multiple edited texts would be able to convey this. It's almost looking more like a Shakespearean sonnet that has certain rules to it. The rules are followed exactly, and his 7 is pulling that up. But as a byproduct, we definitely, if we buy into what Cassuto is trying to say, he's trying to say that the original author of these texts was very mindful of the power of this 7. And that, in the words of Cassuto, is very hard to believe is a mere coincidence. Have you ever seen this stuff from Cassuto before? This was the first time I
never
seen
saw it from Cassuto, but I'm very familiar with the idea. And you're 100% right. Cassuto was a scholar in the first half or the second half of the 1900s, and there was a big push towards scholarship, Bible scholarship, which says that the Torah is written by multiple authors and it's a work of literature. And then what they always do is they point out all these things that can't be coincidences. And he points out that one of those big things is the number 7. 7 is everywhere. You see, the Torah, even as God's book, has to be built on, based on certain principles. And one of the principles, his argument is that one of the principles is 7. And he likes the fact that one of the principles is 7, because since there were 7 days of creation, and that's the first number, and that's the first cycle, so it makes perfect sense that should be the cycle around which the entire Torah is created.
But it really, it kind of, you don't have to buy one of his arguments or two of his arguments. You can say, well, that's obvious. The world was created in 7 days, so it says I was good 7 times. But the cumulative power of all of these things is fascinating, and it makes one say, okay, in our parsha we have this sense of 70 people and the genealogy. It makes you look back at Noah, where it doesn't point out that it's 70, and read it differently. And that's my point. My point is that these numbers become a tool, a way of listening to the narrative in potentially a new way, which is kind of interesting.
Really interesting. And I think, and to think about why 7 should be such an important number. So I'm making a big deal about the fact that 7 is the first number in the Torah, 7 days of the week. But why is 7 completeness? And why is 70 completeness? And why is 49 completeness? It's all based on the cycle, God's cycle. God determined that 7 was the number. Since God determined that 7 was the number, everything revolves around God's 7.
Yeah, and again, it's not as though the tradition was not aware of 10. I think you can assume 10, and I'm no scholar in this regard, but 10 is 10 fingers. It's the easiest way to count. We talk about the digital revolution, where everything is associated with a number. Digits come from our fingers. Those are, if you look up the word digit, it is a finger. So that I get, and that is interesting because that does appear. We do have 70 is 10 times 7, which is fascinating. The rabbis talk about the world being created in 10 phrases. And of course, Cassuto says, well, that he sees a combination there of the 7 that he has identified, and 3 others. But I don't have an answer to why 7 is important, other than the week and the importance of time. But that almost begs the question, how did we get to a 7-day week? It's certainly one of the Jews' greatest contributions to civilization, especially in terms of the 7th day, which is the holy day of rest. But I don't have an answer. All I know is that this little exercise that we're having today is sensitizing me, and hopefully you, to the numbers and the associations that the biblical author and or the rabbis later had with number associations.
I think I mentioned on this Clubhouse class a while ago that there was a book written last year called The Week. And in the book, he traces this idea of the 7-day week. And what I couldn't believe, but seems to be true, is that there have been attempts as recently as the 1800s after the Civil War to try to make the week simpler. The week doesn't work out with the month, because the month is either 30 or 31 days. We all know. Therefore, it's confusing. So in December 10th was whatever day of the week it is. January 10th is going to be another day of the week. And February 10th will be another day of the week. we've taken that for granted that we figure that out and we look it up on calendars. But before they had calendars, that was complicated. Wouldn't it have been easier had the week and the month been in sync? Meaning that the week been 5 or 6 days. So that, wouldn't that have been easier?
Yeah.
And the answer is they tried it.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't work because 7 has been the number since the time of creation. And that really is interesting. You see, sometimes the fact that something wins, even though it doesn't make sense, shows you the power of it. So 7 doesn't make sense. It would have been better to do it the other way. But nevertheless, 7 won. And I thought that was great.
And it speaks to the power, the meaning that we humans also imbue something with. It takes on a life of its own, which I think is fascinating. So I wanted to take the discussion in a slightly different direction, because I did say that I had a kind of a bias against Gematria. And I did a little research. The most preeminent scholar in Talmudic times, in Greco-Roman influences on Judaism, is Professor Saul Lieberman. And he wrote a book, actually, called How Much Hellenism in Jewish Palestine. And in it, he talks about, we've all might have been exposed to the different forms of commentary of Rabbi Yishmael in terms of laws of interpretation, but there is a lesser known rules of being able to understand hermeneutically the text for the Agada, for the narrative portions, the moral, the ethics, and that's 33 midot. There are 33 ways of doing it, and it was the first to cite one of these midot is the numerical values of the text. And according to Lieberman, this was by Abu Lawad ibn Ghana. And as you can tell by his name, this was anything but the rabbinic period. In terms of our experience of Gematria, here's an interesting one. If you remember when we did our episode on Aramaic, and we talked about Eliezer, who was Abraham's servant going down to find a bride for his son. And I said, if you recall, well, the rabbis say it was Eliezer. The truth is it never says Eliezer, but the rabbis learn it, and Rashi quotes from a Gematria, from the numerical value of 318 servants of Abraham. But it's rare and late. And what the interesting thing that Lieberman talks about is that this sense of even ascribing numerical value to numbers comes very late. It's he quotes in the Talmud that they got it from the Greeks in terms of a Mishnah in Shkalim, where they availed themselves the Greek alphabet to put numbers on different jugs. The word Gematria itself, if it sounds like geometry, there's a reason. It's a Greek word. So the first interesting thing is the value of numbers is important. We've pointed that out. But giving these numerical values to each digit is something that was much later as a tool of interpretation. What's fascinating is we've all heard the word sofrim. A sofer is an author in modern-day Hebrew. And the sofrim were one of the earliest interpreters of the Bible. But if you know Hebrew, you know the word lisaper can mean to tell a story. Lispor can mean to count. And here Lieberman says something that after reading Kasuto, we all of a sudden can recognize. And he quotes two pieces of Talmud where they talk about the lost art of counting verses, counting words, and that they ascribe to the Sofrim. So on the one hand, Gematria might be something late, but I think doing something along the lines that we just saw Umberto Cassuto do was maybe a lost art.
That selection from the Talmud, Sofrim, shows that there actually was an entire profession of people who counted the words and the letters of the Torah, exactly what Cassuto did. That's what they did. Now you understand, in those days they didn't have books. The only book they had was the Torah, and the Torah was a holy book. So if you have a holy book, you might as well turn it over and turn it over and turn it over again. And turning it over means reading it and reading it and reading it all the different ways you can read it. And they believed that counting the letters and the words of the Torah was a holy pursuit. I think that's an important thing that needs to be said. That in itself was a holy pursuit.
And it probably, as Cassuto points out, helped with punctuation, helped with structuring the text. So when Cassuto says that there are 7 paragraphs of creation and the Sofrim were great, the Masoratim were great in terms of putting those little square end marks there, it fed itself. They were, the question is how much were they projecting onto the text, and how much were they uncovering some rhythms, some patterns of the text that were helpful in other regards. That to me is kind of fascinating, as much as it goes against my grain to admit this numerology, there is something there that makes it fascinating. I think about 10 years ago there was a book called the Bible Code, and that went a little bit far and made almost to me, the line,
a mockery of it.
I think that's exactly it. And so you have to walk a very interesting line here. And maybe you need scholars like a Cassuto who see it that way to listen to them to help that enrich your experience of reading the text, but not overcome it.
I think you're making a very interesting point about the Sofrim. And that is, we don't really have a sense. We know they counted. What exactly did they count? So the Bible Code took the Sofrim and just kind of exploded it, and everything was allowed. Cassuto limits it. But it's interesting to think about the fact that the minute you start counting things, it's hard to know it's hard to create limits. And basically, to say it a little cynically, but probably truthfully, your ability to count is as good as your ability to come up with a Dvar Torah. Means if your counting will give me a good Dvar Torah, then I'm willing to count. But if your counting is not going to give me anything, what's the point? And I think that's what the Bible Code got. The Bible Code had these crazy things. They predicted World War II and all these kinds of crazy things. So the minute that they actually were able to predict things, people took them seriously. Now, it was wrong to take them seriously, but you understand that. So in a way, and this goes back to the very first thing you said today, and that is your kind of hesitation towards these kinds of numerologies, is that if you get, I think that's our general 21st century view about the numerologies, is we're not afraid to say what Cassuto said. What we're afraid to do is to get carried away. That's dangerous. And that's what the Bible Code did.
So, yeah, I totally agree. But now I want to focus out what we can learn from this number 70 and this sense of how the rabbis took it. You already described this sense of between the walls, and I love that it becomes part of the birth of our nation at that exact moment of transferring from Canaan to Egypt, where our people were born. We had that number 70. I talked about Noah having 70 children and then having this story about languages, and from this the rabbis learned that there are 70 languages. I also mentioned that when the Torah was given, there's this beautiful Talmud that says every utterance emerged from the mouth of the Almighty, divided into 70 languages. What I didn't give you is the metaphor that they took from that. And they said that each word was therefore like a hammer that shatters a rock. Just as a hammer breaks a stone into several fragments, so every and each utterance that emerged from the mouth of the Holy One, blessed be He, divided it into 70 languages. Kepatish yifotzetz sela, nechlak lakama nitzotzot. So now we're starting to see this kind of dynamism, this kind of dialectic between 70 being a sense of complete and perfection, and 70 being something that breaks outside of the boundary of completeness and confection. These nitzatzot, these sparks of when the hammer strikes the rock or the anvil. You know, this sense of language, we all know that you can't translate perfectly, which maybe says something in a negative sense about translating. But the positive sense is that whenever you do translate, you're seeing the original text in a new sense. You're taking it with new nuances. I'll finish by saying that when the Bible was translated into Greek, the word that it was called is the Septuagint. For those of you who know Greek, that comes from the word 70, because by rabbinic tradition, there were 70 scholars put in 70 different rooms, and they all translated the Bible the same. I would love to say that maybe they translated it the same, but by translating it, there was this spark, this diversion, and the rabbis understood that, and that was manifest in this word 70 once again.
I think that's great. And obviously that legend about 70, that's the same thing. You know, 70 is the round number. 70 is the holy number. 70 is the special number. If you're going to have it translated, obviously it's going to be 70, right? It's like if I were to wake you up in the middle of the night and say, how many people translated the Torah? You would say, of course it's 70.
What's interesting is in the actual text, it says some texts say 72 and some say 70. And
we call it the Septuagint, which means the translation of the 70.
Yes. And I would like to argue from that the word 70 was also taken in as a form, as an expression. The other place that you have it, one of the reasons given for it being called the Septuagint, besides these 70 rooms, is that the text of the Greek translation was then sent to the Sanhedrin. How many people are members of the Grand Sanhedrin, Rabbi?
Of course, 70, because that's the only number it can be.
So here too we have this Sanhedrin, and that, by the way, comes out of Numbers 11:16. Then God spoke to Moses, "Gather to me 70 men of the elders of Israel, to whom you know that they are elders of the people and its officers," and that's where he appointed his judges. You cannot mention the 70 members of the Sanhedrin without mentioning the unbelievable, mind-blowing piece of Talmud in Sanhedrin 17a that says, if you have a Sanhedrin in a capital case that has unanimity, each of the 70 judges says that this individual is guilty, he goes free. If there's one or two of them that say, no, I'm not convinced, you can convict him of death. But I'd love to know what your takeaway. My takeaway has always been, if 70 people, let alone 70 Jews, can all agree about something, there's something
wrong with the case. That's correct. And that's the way we've always interpreted it, right? Means you can't have unanimity. There has to be some debate. There has to be a way to see it the other way. If you can't see it the other way, you haven't tried hard enough to find the other argument. Isn't that a great way to kind of pull the whole thing together?
It really speaks to this sense that 7 might be complete, and perfect, but perfection can never be unanimous,
The whole story,
universal.
right.
There has to be an outlier. There has to be something that's open to discussion, whether it's a translation or a judgment. And, maybe if I knew more about numbers, I would be able to understand how 7 is unique. It's clearly not, it's not divisible by whole numbers. So there's something there, but I just think that the Sanhedrin and the Septuagint and that hammer hitting the anvil and making sparks as a metaphor for Torah is a beautiful message of what those 70 individuals going down to Egypt had in store for themselves when they launched our nation.
What a great topic. So thank you for talking about numerology. Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Enjoy 70 and think of all the other examples of 7 and 70 and 49 that we have in our tradition. Our tradition is full of them. Happy New Year. And we look forward to continuing. It'll be 2023. But next Thursday night, we are going to continue with Vayechi. And then we will bring an end to the book of Breshit, the book of Genesis. Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Shabbat Shalom, Geoffrey and everybody. And we look forward to next week. Be well, everybody.
Shabbat Shalom. Let the force of 70 be with you all. And if any of you have any comments or suggestions or something that you want to share with us, please go ahead and raise your hand. And I would love to invite you up to the Bima. Hey, Michael.
Hey, Geoffrey, thank you. What a blessing to come on today. I'm driving, but I just wanted to add to the mix that the year 2023 numerologically adds up to 7.
Wow.
Yeah, so I didn't want to overlook it. And of course, I believe and feel numerology. And I think that it's very deep. And so I think there's something going on. This is going to be a powerful time of alignment. Hanukkah and Christmas were also the same crescent moon rising. I checked that out, the last day of Hanukkah and the day of Christmas. So there's something going on that I just wanted to share. And thanks for a great Mud League today.
So, Michael, I think that's amazing that you link our discussion today of Shivim, of 70, to the new year, which adds up to 7. Because one of the sources that I had wanted to bring, but I had neglected to bring, was right out of the Haggadah. It says, Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah said, "Behold, I am like a 70-year-old man, yet I have not merited to understand why the exodus from Egypt should be said at night until Ben Zoma explained it to me." And from this, we learn that Shivim Shana can also mean 70 years, and whether it means that he felt like he became an old person, which is the mainstream explanation because he was very young when he was appointed to be the head of the Sanhedrin, or maybe because he was from another generation. There were 70 years that the Jews were in captivity in Babylonia. There was 70 years, plus or minus, where the second temple was being rebuilt. So maybe he was saying, I'm a man of a different generation, of the generation of the Galut, of the destruction. And I didn't know whether we should say the exodus from Egypt only during good times during the day, or also during bad times. But I love that he associates 70 with years, and we are about to celebrate a new year. And I'm also reminded of the Chinese that give every year a face. Every year is associated with a different animal. And that was why I called the podcast 70 Faces, Shivim Panim, because there is a tradition that every verse has 70 faces, 70 different explanations at least. So for this coming year, let us discover the face of the year. Let us discover the different textures of our texts and of our friends and family, and wishing you all a very happy new year. Shabbat Shalom.